Lioness abandons her white cub for looking different. You won't believe what happens next. The African dawn broke with its usual splendor, painting the savannah in shades of gold and amber. Henry Caldwell had witnessed thousands of such sunrises during his 40-year career as a ranger. But retirement hadn't dulled his appreciation for the wild's daily rebirth. At 68, his weathered hands still reached automatically for his binoculars each morning, and his leather notebook remained perpetually tucked into the breast pocket of his faded khaki jacket. Sleep had eluded Henry that particular night, as it often did when the dry season winds carried the distant calls of the pride he'd been monitoring for months. Something in the air felt different, charged with the anticipation that only comes before significant events in the wilderness. Rising earlier than his usual pre-dawn routine, Henry dressed quietly in the small ranger's cabin that had been his home for the past decade, ever since the reserve board had graciously allowed him to remain on the property after his official retirement. The morning air was crisp against his skin as he stepped onto the wooden porch, the boards creaking familiarly under his worn boots. Henry had never married, never had children of his own. His colleagues often joked that he'd been wedded to the savannah instead, and perhaps there was truth in that observation. While other men his age spoke of grandchildren and family gatherings, Henry's conversations revolved around migration patterns, breeding cycles, and conservation success stories. Through his binoculars, Henry scanned the acacia grove where Nala's pride had established their territory. He'd been tracking this particular lioness for 3 years, documenting her behavior patterns and noting the gradual changes in the local ecosystem. Nala was a magnificent specimen, strong, intelligent, and fiercely protective of her previous litters. She was also heavily pregnant, her sides bulging with the promise of new life. As the sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the grassland, Henry noticed unusual activity near the rocky outcropping that served as the pride's primary denning site. Nala had isolated herself from the other females, her breathing labored and rhythmic. Henry felt his pulse quicken with the familiar excitement that came with witnessing one of nature's most profound moments. "Easy, girl," he whispered to himself, adjusting his binoculars for a clearer view. "Take your time." The labor lasted through the morning and well into the afternoon. Henry remained at his observation post, making careful notes about the duration and Nala's behavior patterns. This was Nala's 4th litter, and her experience showed in the way she positioned herself and managed her breathing. Other lionesses from the pride maintained a respectful distance, occasionally approaching to offer social support through gentle nuzzling and soft vocalizations. When the first cub emerged, Henry smiled with the satisfaction of a man who'd witnessed this miracle countless times, yet never lost his sense of wonder. The tiny creature was perfect, golden-furred like its mother, mewling with healthy lungs, as Nala immediately began the essential process of cleaning and stimulating circulation. The second cub followed 20 minutes later, equally robust and vocal. Nala's maternal instincts kicked into high gear as she positioned both cubs near her belly, encouraging their first attempts at nursing. Her rough tongue worked methodically, removing birth membranes and stimulating the cub's breathing and circulation. But it was the third cub that made Henry's breath catch in his throat. Unlike its siblings, this cub was noticeably different. Where the others displayed the typical tawny coat of their species, this one was completely white, not the cream-colored variation occasionally seen in lions, but a pure, stark white that seemed to glow against the red earth. The cub was also significantly smaller than its littermates, its breathing shallow and irregular. Henry had heard stories of albino lions, but in 4 decades of fieldwork, he'd never encountered one. He knew immediately that this was both an extraordinary discovery and a potential tragedy in the making. Albinism in wild animals was rare and often fatal, not just due to the physical challenges it presented, but because of the social rejection it frequently triggered within animal communities. Through his binoculars, Henry watched as Nala's initial maternal response kicked in. She licked the white cub just as she had the others, stimulating its breathing and attempting to position it for nursing. But even in those first moments, Henry could see hesitation in her movements. Her attention kept returning to the 2 golden cubs, who were stronger and more responsive to her ministrations. "Come on, little one," Henry murmured, unconsciously leaning forward as if his encouragement could somehow reach across the distance. Fight for it. As the hours passed, the disparity in treatment became more pronounced. The two golden cubs had found their nursing positions and were feeding regularly, their small bodies growing warmer and stronger with each passing hour. The white cub, however, struggled to maintain its position. Each time it managed to latch on, one of its siblings would inevitably push it aside, and Nala made no effort to intervene. By evening, other members of the pride had begun to investigate the new arrivals. The lionesses approached cautiously, their behavior following the ancient protocol of inspecting and accepting new cubs into the group. But when they encountered the white cub, their reactions were markedly different. Instead of the gentle sniffing and social bonding that characterized their interactions with the golden cubs, they displayed obvious unease. Henry watched with growing concern as one of the older lionesses, a matriarch named Kessie, whom he'd known for years, actually growled at the white cub when it tried to approach. The tiny creature stumbled backward, its weak legs barely able to support its weight, and huddled in a corner of the den, while its mother and pride sisters focused their attention on its more acceptable siblings. That night, Henry sat in his cabin, staring at the pages of notes he'd accumulated throughout the day. His handwriting, usually neat and clinical, betrayed his emotional investment in the unfolding drama. Alongside objective observations about birth weights and nursing behavior were more personal notations. White cub pushed away again during feeding, and mother showing clear preference for golden cubs. Henry had witnessed countless examples of natural selection in action. He understood intellectually that nature was neither cruel nor kind, it simply was. Animals that couldn't adapt to their environment didn't survive, and that harsh reality had shaped evolution for millions of years. But understanding the process didn't make it any easier to watch when it involved a creature as vulnerable and innocent as the white cub. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams of white fur and blue eyes struggling against insurmountable odds. When Henry finally gave up on rest and emerged from his cabin in the pre-dawn darkness, he was surprised to find that he'd been unconsciously preparing for another day of observation. His binoculars hung around his neck, his notebook was tucked into his pocket, and his mind was already focused on the rocky outcropping where 3 tiny lives hung in the balance. The second day brought more of the same troubling patterns. The golden cubs were thriving, their nursing periods becoming longer and more efficient. They'd begun the process of bonding with their mother through scent and touch, their small bodies curling against hers in the instinctive search for warmth and security. The white cub, meanwhile, grew progressively weaker. Nala's rejection wasn't malicious. Henry had observed enough animal behavior to understand that it was simply practical. In the harsh environment of the African savanna, a mother's resources were limited, and natural selection favored investing those resources in offspring with the highest probability of survival. The white cub's unusual coloration marked it as different, potentially defective, and Nala's instincts were telling her to focus her attention elsewhere. But practical understanding didn't make the situation any less heartbreaking to witness. Throughout the day, Henry documented the white cub's increasingly desperate attempts to secure its mother's attention and nourishment. Each time it managed to begin nursing, it was quickly displaced by a stronger sibling. Each time it sought warmth and comfort, it found itself gradually pushed to the periphery of the family group. By the afternoon of the third day, the white cub had stopped trying to nurse altogether. It lay in the corner of the den, its breathing shallow and its tiny body trembling with cold, despite the warm African air. Henry knew from experience that cubs who stop feeding rarely survive more than a day or two. "This isn't working," he said aloud to himself, his voice rough with emotion. "Something has to be done." The ethical dilemma that had been building in Henry's mind finally came to a head. As a trained conservationist, he understood the importance of allowing natural processes to unfold without human interference. The wilderness had its own laws, its own way of maintaining balance, and human intervention often caused more problems than it solved. But Henry also understood that the modern African savanna was no longer the truly wild environment it had been in previous centuries. Human activity had fragmented habitats, reduced prey populations, and altered the delicate balance that had previously governed predator-prey relationships. In such an environment, it was strict, Non-interference, really the most ethical approach. That evening, Henry sat at his small wooden desk, staring at a blank report form. For the first time in his career, he was contemplating recommending human intervention in a natural process. The decision went against decades of training and professional philosophy. But as he looked at the pages of notes documenting the white cub's deteriorating condition, he realized that his heart had already made the choice. The next morning brought confirmation of Henry's worst fears. Through his binoculars, he could see that the white cub had barely moved from its position in the corner of the den. Its siblings were active and alert, exploring their immediate surroundings and engaging in the early play behavior that would eventually develop into hunting skills. The white cub, however, lay motionless, except for the barely perceptible rise and fall of its tiny chest. Henry lowered his binoculars and reached for his radio, a piece of equipment he'd rarely used since retirement, except for weekly check-ins with reserve headquarters. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the frequency, and he had to clear his throat twice before he trusted his voice to remain steady. Base, this is Henry Caldwell at Observation Post 7. Do you copy? The response came immediately, crackling with static. Henry, this is Sarah at base. Good to hear from you. What's your status, Sarah Mitchell? Was the current head of wildlife management for the reserve, a competent woman in her 40s who'd taken over the position when Henry stepped down. She respected his experience and had always been receptive to his input. But Henry knew that what he was about to propose would test that relationship. Sarah, I need to report an unusual situation. I've been monitoring Nala's pride for the past 4 days. She gave birth to 3 cubs. But one of them is completely white, appears to be albino. The pride is rejecting it, and it's not going to survive without intervention. There was a long pause before Sarah's voice returned. Is more cautious now. Henry, you know our policy on intervention in natural processes. We've discussed this many times. I know the policy. Sarah, but this isn't just any animal. This is potentially one of the rarest genetic variations in African lions. From a scientific standpoint alone, we can't afford to lose it. Henry could hear the sound of papers shuffling on Sarah's end of the radio connection. He imagined her pulling out policy manuals and consulting the guidelines that govern their conservation efforts. What exactly are you proposing? Henry. The question he'd been dreading had finally been asked. Henry took a deep breath and committed himself to a course of action that would change the trajectory of his retirement. I'm requesting permission to remove the cub from the pride and bring it to the rehabilitation center. If we act quickly, there's a good chance it can be saved. Once it's stabilized, we can evaluate options for its long-term care. Another long pause. This one even more uncomfortable than the first. Henry knew that Sarah was weighing the scientific value of preserving such a rare individual against the established protocols that govern reserve operations. Henry, this is a big decision. I'm going to need to consult with the board and get input from our veterinary team. Can you continue monitoring the situation until tomorrow morning? Henry glanced toward the rocky outcropping where he knew a tiny white cub was fighting for its life. Every hour of delay reduced the chances of successful intervention. But he also understood that Sarah couldn't authorize such an unprecedented action without proper consultation. I can monitor until tomorrow. But Sarah, time is critical here. If we wait too long, there won't be anything left to save. Understood. I'll have an answer for you by 0800 tomorrow. In the meantime, document everything you can. If we do proceed with intervention, we'll need complete records to justify the decision. Henry spent the rest of that day creating the most detailed wildlife observation report of his career. Every feeding attempt, every social interaction, every sign of the white cub's declining condition was meticulously recorded. He included behavioral observations, estimated weights based on visual assessment, and detailed descriptions of the pride's rejection behaviors. As the sun set over the savannah, Henry found himself offering a silent prayer to whatever forces governed the wilderness. He'd never been a particularly religious man, but 40 years of observing the intricate balance of nature had given him a deep appreciation for the mysterious forces that shaped life and death in the wild. The next morning arrived with unusual cloud cover, creating a subdued atmosphere that seemed to mirror Henry's emotional state. He was at his observation post before dawn, watching through his binoculars as the Pride began their daily routines. The two golden cubs were noticeably more active, their movements stronger and more coordinated than they'd been just days earlier. The white cub remained motionless in its corner, and Henry wasn't even certain it was still breathing. At exactly 0800, his radio crackled to life. "Henry, this is Sarah. I've got news." Henry's heart pounded as he waited for her response. Everything he'd worked for, everything he believed about conservation and the value of preserving rare genetic variations, hung in the balance of her next words. "The board met in emergency session last night. We consulted with 3 independent wildlife veterinarians and 2 genetic specialists. The consensus is that the scientific value of preserving this individual outweighs our normal non-intervention policies. You have authorization to proceed with rescue operations." Henry felt a rush of relief so intense it nearly buckled his knees. "Thank you, Sarah. What kind of support can I expect, Doctor?" "Martinez and a full veterinary team will be at your location within 2 hours. We're also sending a transport vehicle equipped for neonatal care." Sarah's voice softened slightly. "The board was impressed by your documentation and your arguments for intervention. This is the right thing to do." The next 2 hours passed with agonizing slowness as Henry maintained his vigil over the failing cub. He could see that its condition had deteriorated significantly overnight, and he began to worry that they might be too late. But when the sound of vehicles finally reached his ears, hope flared again in his chest. Dr. Elena Martinez was a wildlife veterinarian with 15 years of experience in large carnivore rehabilitation. Henry had worked with her on several previous cases and trusted her judgment completely. She emerged from the lead vehicle with her characteristic blend of professional competence and genuine compassion for the animals in her care. "What's the situation, Henry?" she asked without preamble, already pulling on protective gloves and checking her medical supplies. "The cub hasn't moved in over 6 hours. It stopped trying to nurse yesterday afternoon. Based on my observations, it's severely dehydrated and probably hypothermic, despite the ambient temperature." "Doctor." Martinez nodded grimly. "We'll need to move fast." "Do you have current locations on the Pride?" Henry consulted his most recent notes. "Nala took the 2 healthy cubs out of the den about an hour ago. They're approximately 200 meters northeast, near the watering hole. The rest of the Pride is scattered, but none of them are close to the den site." The extraction operation proceeded with military precision. While Dr. Martinez and her assistant approached the den, Henry positioned himself at a vantage point where he could monitor the Pride's location and provide warning if any of the adult lions began returning to the area. The veterinary team worked quickly but carefully, aware that every moment of delay reduced the cub's chances of survival. When Dr. Martinez emerged from the den, carrying a small bundle wrapped in warming blankets, Henry felt tears prick his eyes. The white cub looked impossibly tiny and fragile, its breathing barely perceptible. But it was alive. "We got him, Doctor," Martinez announced, her voice tight with concentration. "But he's in critical condition. We need to get him to the clinic immediately." The drive to the rehabilitation center seemed to take forever, though Henry knew it was actually less than 30 minutes. He rode in the back of the medical transport vehicle, watching as Dr. Martinez and her team worked to stabilize the cub's vital signs. An IV line delivered essential fluids and nutrients directly into the tiny body, while warming pads helped combat the hypothermia that threatened to shut down its already compromised systems. "Is he going to make it?" Henry asked quietly, not wanting to distract the medical team, but unable to contain his anxiety. "Doctor." Martinez looked up from her patient long enough to meet his eyes. "It's touch and go, but he's got a fighting chance. The fact that he survived 4 days with minimal nutrition shows remarkable resilience." At the rehabilitation center, Henry watched as the cub was transferred to a specialized incubator designed for orphaned carnivore infants. The transparent walls of the incubator allowed constant monitoring while maintaining the controlled environment necessary for recovery. Tubes and wires connected the tiny body to various monitoring devices, creating a high-tech cocoon around the struggling life within. "What happens now?" Henry asked as Dr. Martinez completed her initial assessment. "Now we wait and see how he responds to treatment. The next 48 hours will be critical." If he can stabilize and begin taking nutrition consistently, his chances improve dramatically. Henry found himself reluctant to leave the clinic, even though there was nothing more he could do to help. He'd invested so much emotional energy in the cub's rescue that the thought of going home to his empty cabin felt almost unbearable. "Henry, Doctor," Martinez said gently, "why don't you go get some rest? I promise I'll call if there are any significant changes." But rest proved elusive. Henry lay awake in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the night sounds of the savannah outside his window. Every few hours, he found himself reaching for his radio. It's tempted to check on the cub's condition, but not wanting to interfere with the medical team's work. The call finally came at dawn. "Henry, this is Elena. You need to get down here." The tone of her voice sent ice water through Henry's veins. He was dressed and out the door within minutes, his heart hammering with the certainty that he was too late, that despite all their efforts, the little white cub hadn't survived the night. But when he burst through the clinic doors, "Doctor," Martinez was smiling. "He's asking for breakfast," she announced, gesturing toward the incubator, where a pair of bright blue eyes peered out at the world with newfound alertness. Henry felt his knees go weak with relief. He's going to be okay, it's still early. But all his vital signs have stabilized overnight. He took 2 full bottles of formula and seems to be responding well to the warming treatment. "I think our little fighter is going to make it." As Henry approached the incubator, the white cub lifted its head and seemed to focus on his face. The blue eyes, so unusual in a lion, held an intelligence and awareness that hadn't been present during the rescue operation. "Hello there, little one," Henry whispered, pressing his hand against the clear wall of the incubator. "You gave us quite a scare." "Doctor," Martinez joined him at the incubator, her expression thoughtful. "He's going to need round-the-clock care for at least the next few weeks. Someone will need to bottle feed him every few hours, monitor his development, and gradually introduce him to more solid nutrition as he grows." Henry didn't hesitate. "I'll do it." "Henry, that's a significant commitment. We're talking about months of intensive care, and lions have very specific dietary and social needs as they mature." "I understand that, Elena, but I got him into this situation by recommending intervention. I'm not going to abandon him now." "Doctor." Martinez studied Henry's face for a long moment, seeing something there that satisfied her concerns. "All right, but we do this properly. I'll train you in all the care protocols, and we'll establish a schedule for regular veterinary checkups. This cub is going to need every advantage we can give him." Over the next several days, Henry immersed himself in the intensive routine of caring for an orphan lion cub. Every 3 hours, day and night, and he prepared formula and offered it in specially designed bottles that mimicked the experience of nursing from a mother. He learned to monitor body temperature, recognize signs of illness or distress, and provide the constant physical contact that was essential for proper psychological development. The cub, whom Henry had begun calling Ash due to his unusual coloring, responded remarkably well to the consistent care. His weight increased steadily, his movements became more coordinated, and his vocalizations grew stronger and more demanding when feeding time approached. But it was the bond developing between them that surprised Henry most. Ash seemed to recognize him specifically, showing obvious excitement when Henry entered the room and settling more readily when Henry was the one providing care. During feeding sessions, the cub would often pause in his nursing to gaze up at Henry with those startling blue eyes, as if memorizing every detail of the face that had become his world. "You've got yourself a son there, Doctor," Martinez observed one afternoon, watching as Ash played with the hem of Henry's khaki jacket while balanced on his lap. Henry felt his cheeks warm with embarrassment, but he didn't deny the observation. Somewhere in the process of saving Ash's life, he discovered something he'd never known he was missing. The cub provided a focus and purpose that retirement had taken away. But more than that, he provided the kind of unconditional affection that Henry had never experienced in his solitary life. As Ash grew stronger and more mobile, Henry moved him from the clinical environment of the rehabilitation center to a specially prepared enclosure at his own cabin. The setup included both indoor and outdoor spaces, allowing Ash to experience natural sunlight and fresh air while maintaining the security necessary for his continued development. Henry's daily routine revolved entirely around Ash's needs. Morning began with bottle feeding and health checks, followed by supervised outdoor time, where Ash could explore his surroundings and develop his natural curiosity about the world. Afternoons involved training sessions where Henry used toys and games to encourage hunting behaviors and physical development. Evenings ended with another feeding and quiet bonding time before Ash settled into his sleeping area. The transformation in both of them was remarkable. Ash grew from a struggling infant into a healthy, playful juvenile lion whose unusual coloring only made him more striking. His white coat took on a lustrous quality as proper nutrition filled out his frame, and his blue eyes developed an alertness and intelligence that impressed every visitor to the cabin. Henry, meanwhile, discovered reserves of patience and nurturing instinct he'd never known he possessed. The man who had spent 40 years maintaining professional distance from the animals he protected found himself singing lullabies to a lion cub and feeling genuine pride at every milestone in Ash's development. But as Ash approached his first birthday, new challenges began to emerge. The playful nips and pounces that had been endearing in a small cub became more serious as Ash grew larger and stronger. His hunting instincts were developing exactly as they should, but in the artificial environment of the enclosure, those instincts had nowhere to be properly expressed. Dr. Martinez raised the issue during one of their regular consultation meetings. Henry, we need to start thinking about Ash's long-term future. He's becoming a fully mature lion, and his needs are changing. Henry had been dreading this conversation, but he knew it was inevitable. What are our options? Ideally, we'd want to reintroduce him to a wild environment where he could live as lions are meant to live. But his coloring makes that problematic. White lions are extremely rare in the wild, partly because they have difficulty with camouflage during hunting. Henry nodded grimly. He'd been researching the challenges facing white lions and understood that Ash's beautiful coat was both his most distinctive feature and his greatest liability in a natural environment. We could consider placement in a reputable zoo or wildlife sanctuary. Dr. Martinez continued. There are facilities specifically designed for lions with special needs, and Ash would receive excellent care. The thought of losing Ash to another facility made Henry's chest tighten with anxiety. Over the past year, the lion had become more than just a conservation project. He'd become family. The idea of separating them felt like a betrayal of everything they'd been through together. What about keeping him here? Henry asked quietly. Dr. Martinez sighed, her expression sympathetic. Henry, you know that's not really feasible. Ash is going to continue growing, and his strength and instincts are going to make him potentially dangerous. You're not equipped to house a full-grown lion safely. But Henry had been thinking about this problem for months, and he'd come up with a proposal that he hoped might satisfy everyone's concerns. What if we formalized the arrangement? The reserve could establish a permanent white lion exhibit with proper facilities and safety protocols. Ash could serve as an educational ambassador, helping visitors understand conservation issues while living in an environment that meets his needs. The idea gained momentum quickly once Henry presented it to the reserve board. The scientific value of maintaining such a rare individual for research purposes was significant, and the potential educational impact was enormous. Visitors would have the opportunity to see a white lion up close while learning about genetics, conservation challenges, and the complex relationship between humans and wildlife. Construction of the new facility took 6 months, during which time Ash continued to live at Henry's cabin under increasingly elaborate safety protocols. The finished enclosure was a masterpiece of wildlife facility design, featuring multiple environments that allowed Ash to experience different aspects of his natural habitat while maintaining the security necessary for public safety. But the most important feature of the new facility was the small apartment built into one corner of the complex. Henry would continue to serve as Ash's primary caretaker, living on site and maintaining the bond that had sustained them both through the challenges of the past 2 years. The day they moved Ash to his new home was bittersweet for Henry. The spacious enclosure was everything a captive lion could want: large territories to patrol, elevated resting areas that satisfied his instinct to survey his domain, and enrichment features that would keep his mind and body engaged. But it also represented the end of the intimate, family-like relationship they'd shared in the smaller cabin environment. To Henry's surprise, Ash seemed to understand and approve of the new arrangement. He explored every inch of his new territory with obvious satisfaction, marking boundaries and establishing routines that demonstrated his comfort with the expanded space. But when evening came, he invariably returned to the area nearest Henry's apartment, settling down where he could maintain visual contact with the human who had raised him. The White Lion exhibit opened to the public 6 months later, and the response exceeded everyone's expectations. Visitors came from around the world to see Ash, drawn by the rarity of his coloring and the remarkable story of his rescue and rehabilitation. Henry found himself serving as both caretaker and educator, sharing Ash's story with school groups, researchers, and curious tourists who wanted to understand the complex world of wildlife conservation. But the most rewarding moments came during the quiet times when the facility was closed to visitors. In the evenings, Henry would sit in his favorite chair on the apartment's small porch while Ash lounged nearby, the two of them watching the sunset paint the savannah in familiar shades of gold and amber. These were the times when Henry felt most grateful for the series of events that had brought them together: a sleepless night, a difficult decision, and the courage to intervene when intervention was needed. As Ash matured into full adulthood, his bond with Henry only deepened. The massive white lion, now weighing over 400 pounds and possessing all the power and dignity of his species, remained as gentle and affectionate with Henry as he had been as a cub. Visitors were amazed to see such a magnificent predator nuzzling against the elderly man like an oversized house cat, responding to verbal commands and participating in daily care routines with obvious cooperation and trust. Dr. Martinez, now a regular visitor to the facility, often marveled at the relationship she'd helped facilitate. "I've never seen anything like it," she told Henry during one of her routine health checks. "Ash trusts you completely, but he still maintains all his natural lion behaviors and instincts. It's like you've achieved the perfect balance between domestication and wildness." Henry understood what she meant, though he would have described it differently. To him, Ash wasn't a domesticated animal, but rather a wild creature who had chosen to share his life with a human companion. The distinction was important because it preserved Ash's dignity as a lion, while acknowledging the unique circumstances that had shaped their relationship. As the years passed, Henry began to slow down in the way that aging brings to all living creatures. His morning walks became shorter, his movements more careful, and his afternoon naps longer. But Ash seemed to sense these changes and adjusted his own behavior accordingly, becoming more protective and attentive to Henry's needs. When Henry was diagnosed with arthritis that made walking difficult, Ash took to following him more closely during their daily routines, positioning himself where Henry could use him for balance and support. When Henry's hearing began to fail, Ash became more vocal, using different sounds to communicate specific needs and desires. The reserve staff began to refer to them as the odd couple, but there was genuine affection in the nickname. Everyone who worked at the facility had come to appreciate the special relationship between the aging ranger and the white lion he'd saved as a cub. Their daily interactions had become as much a part of the attraction as Ash's rare coloring, demonstrating to visitors the profound connections that could exist between humans and wildlife. On Henry's 75th birthday, the reserve threw a small celebration at the lion exhibit. As Henry sat in his wheelchair, a recent necessity due to his declining mobility, Ash positioned himself protectively beside the chair, accepting congratulations from staff and visitors with the dignified patience that had become his trademark. "You know," Henry said to Sarah Mitchell, who had come to help him celebrate, "I spent 40 years trying to protect nature, but it turns out nature had a few things to teach me about family." Sarah smiled, watching as Ash gently rested his massive head on Henry's lap. "I think you both found exactly what you needed in each other." As the sun set over the savannah that evening, Henry sat on his porch with Ash lying beside him in their familiar positions. The white lion's breathing was deep and even, the sound of perfect contentment. Henry's own breathing had become more labored in recent months. But in moments like these, surrounded by the peace of the wilderness he'd spent his life protecting, he felt a satisfaction deeper than anything he'd ever experienced. His leather notebook, now filled with years of observations about Ash's development and behavior, lay open on his lap. The final entry, written in his increasingly shaky handwriting, to read simply, "Today marks 7 years since I first saw a white cub struggling for life in a rocky den. I never had children of my own, but I realize now that I was always meant to be Ash's father. In saving his life, he saved mine." The bond between Henry Caldwell and Ash, the white lion, had become legendary throughout the conservation community, a testament to the power of compassion and the unexpected forms that family could take. Visitors to the reserve would often leave with tears in their eyes, moved by the obvious love between the elderly man and the magnificent creature who had chosen him as pack leader, protector, and friend. And in the quiet moments between public visiting hours, when the African sun painted the sky in its eternal palette of gold and crimson, an aging ranger and a white lion would sit together in comfortable silence. Two unlikely souls who had found in each other exactly what they had been missing all along.